When the handcuffs snapped around my wrists, my father didn't look shocked. He looked proud. I'm Adriana Cole, and in that frozen second, while two federal officers dragged me past a room full of staring strangers, I realized something I had spent my whole life refusing to believe. My own father would rather see me destroyed than admit he ever misjudged me. He raised his chin, told everyone he was protecting the country, and didn't spare me a single glance, not of worry, not of doubt, not of love. And as the cameras clicked and the whispers spread, I understood the truth I had been running from since childhood. He wasn't trying to save me. He was finally getting rid of me. That was the moment everything broke. Flagstaff lay under the kind of mountain darkness that seeps into your skin. The cold, dry wind sliding beneath my collar as I crossed the parking lot. The community center glowed bright against the night. Cars packed into every corner, voices spilling out from the entrance like a warm tide I wanted no part of. I pulled the scarf my mother had given me tighter around my neck, trying to ignore the familiar knot of reluctance twisting in my chest. She had asked me to come. That was the only reason I was here. Inside, the soft gold of the overhead lights mixed with the smell of grilled meat and the steady rhythm of an acoustic guitar. Everyone else looked at ease. I felt like an outsider who'd wandered into the wrong house. The moment I stepped into the hall, I saw him. My father stood near the honor table, shoulders squared, chin high, greeting everyone with the same confident grin he'd perfected years ago. He carried himself as though the entire event centered around him, as though his presence alone was a gift to the room. I kept my distance, avoiding his eyes, not wanting to spark whatever narrative he had prepared about me this time. The contrast between us was sharp enough to feel physical. He radiated pride. I just wanted a shadow to dissolve into. I slipped toward the serving counter and wrapped my fingers around a glass of wine I never intended to drink. People passed with polite nods, but their expressions carried something else, something my father had planted and nurtured for years. A quiet judgment, a story they believed without ever hearing my side. I caught whispers, small glances traded between familiar faces. Not hostile, just confirming. Then the door at the end of the hall burst open. The sound sliced clean through the music. Two military security officers stepped inside, their rigid expressions instantly draining the warmth from the room. They walked with purpose, each step heavy with authority, the overhead light glinting off the black badges on their chests. They weren't here for a social visit. They were here for me. One of them asked my name. His tone controlled but loud enough to silence the tables around us. I answered because I had no other choice. The second officer told me to turn around and spoke the words that cracked the night open, that I was being detained for threatening national security. Somewhere behind me, my mother dropped her scarf. Her hands shook too much to reach for it. My father, though, stepped forward, not in shock, but in something disturbingly close to satisfaction. He lifted his hand as if accepting applause, thanking the crowd for helping him protect the country. His voice rang with pride, a pride that sucked the air straight out of my lungs. I didn't resist, didn't argue, didn't defend myself. I couldn't. One wrong sentence would have shattered everything I'd spent years protecting. Cameras flashed, murmurs rippled, and metal tightened around my wrists. They led me out of the hall, past rows of stunned faces, and all I could feel was the brutal collision of two worlds, one I lived in, and one they thought they understood crashing into each other so hard that something in me cracked with them. I drove through the Arizona night with the kind of exhaustion that clings to your bones after too many hours underground. Even the fading streaks of sunset still hurt my eyes. Sharp reminders of how long I'd been away from natural light. By the time the San Francisco peaks rose in the distance, the sky had slipped into a muted orange, making the whole landscape feel familiar, yet strangely distant. When I turned into my parents' driveway, the front door opened before I even stepped out of the car. My mother stood there as if afraid I might change my mind and leave. She pulled me into a long, desperate embrace, the kind that made me realize how long she'd been waiting. My father stayed back in the living room, offering the smallest nod, the kind he gave acquaintances rather than family. Dinner was its usual choreography of uneven energy. My mother filled the space with questions about my meals, my sleep, my workload, as if talking fast enough could keep the tension from surfacing. My father barely spoke, but his eyes tracked every movement I made. The air between them felt thick, like honey left too long in the jar, heavy and suffocating. I avoided mentioning anything about work, and the more I dodged, the sharper his stare became. There was always something about silence that he treated like an admission. After the meal, I retreated to my room, body aching with fatigue. I didn't even bother locking my suitcase, an oversight I regretted within hours. A hard knock jolted me awake. My father stood in the doorway, holding the satellite diagram I'd forgotten to put away. The page was crumpled in his fist, edges bent. The imprint of his grip pressed deep into the paper. He stepped inside without waiting for permission, pulling out a chair and planting himself in front of me. He questioned me with a cold precision, each inquiry clipped and deliberate, as if he were conducting an interrogation instead of speaking to his daughter. I kept my voice steady, offering partial answers, careful not to reveal anything real, but my caution only fed his suspicion. I saw it gathering in his expression, a kind of certainty that frightened me more than the questions themselves. Then it happened. In the dim kitchen light, he said he needed to protect this family's honor at any cost. He told me he believed I was connected to some extremist group, convinced that the diagram was proof. For a moment I couldn't breathe, not because of the accusation, but because I saw something in his eyes I had never allowed myself to see before, a deep, unwavering distrust. I didn't know that while I slept. He left the house. I didn't know he drove through the night to Peterson Space Force Base, using his veteran status. He filed a formal suspicion report, convinced he was doing his patriotic duty. I had no idea. But that single decision was the first stone that sent the rest of my world crashing down. The next morning, in Colorado, my secure terminal displayed a classified alert the moment I logged in. My civilian file had been flagged. I stared at the screen for several seconds, feeling the ground shift beneath me. Someone had crossed a line. Someone had reached into a part of my life that wasn't meant to be touched. General Carter summoned me immediately. The small, windowless room felt even tighter when he closed the door behind us. He placed the red-marked folder on the table and tapped it once, the gesture he always used when news was bad. There was no anger in his expression, only a warning. My father had submitted a report to Peterson, a report built entirely from guesswork and fear. The consequences were far worse than he could have imagined. A young captain named Ryland saw the report as a chance to prove himself, instead of escalating through proper channels or consulting interagency authority. He insisted on opening a full investigation. Carter explained that Peterson had no knowledge of my assignment, no understanding of the program I worked within, and no idea that they were about to breach a classification tier reserved for a fraction of the national defense structure. He offered to wipe the flag from my file, shut down the report, and bury the incident with his own authority. I told him no. I couldn't let someone else keep patching the holes my father punched into the walls around me. It was the first time I refused a lifeline. Then the next blow hit. I discovered my father had spoken to a local journalist, claiming something was being hidden from the American people. The rumor spread quickly. Peterson took it as confirmation that they'd uncovered an internal threat and acted before verifying a single detail. In that moment, it became painfully clear this was no longer a family argument across a dinner table. It was no longer about a stubborn father and the daughter he refused to understand. This was a collision between truth and pride. One powerful enough to swallow me whole if I didn't move carefully, and I was standing directly at the fault line. Returning to Cheyenne Mountain felt like stepping back inside a steel cavern. The doors slid shut behind me, sealing out the world in one cold breath. The faint blue glow from the radar screens spilled across the walls, and the hum under the floor vibrated like a warning. I walked deeper into the complex, knowing something had already slipped out of my control. General Carter waited in a windowless room, the kind used only for bad news. He didn't waste a word, just pushed a red file across the table. The color alone made my stomach tighten. I opened it to find my father's name at the top, and right beneath it, Captain Ryland. He hadn't just approved my father's report. He had escalated it to every young officer at Peterson, framing it as the basis of a potential arrest operation. They were already imagining a threat that didn't exist. Carter explained the real danger if Peterson activated a second investigation phase. NORAD would be forced into the loop, and everything I had kept hidden would be exposed within hours. This was no longer about suspicion or pride. It was national systems bending the wrong way because two men didn't understand what they were touching. I told him I would handle it, but the look he gave me slipped straight beneath my defenses. He said the person putting me at risk wasn't an enemy of the country. It was my father. The truth landed heavier than the steel walls around us. When I stepped out, my phone buzzed with a final blow. Peterson had deployed a team to Flagstaff. They were headed straight toward my family. The fire was already spreading in my backyard. I drove through the night toward Flagstaff, headlights cutting across empty highway. By sunrise, I turned into my parents' street, dew still clinging to the grass. My father stood on this porch with his arms folded, waiting like he expected a confession. I asked why he involved the press. He said citizens had a duty when the government failed. The conviction in his voice slammed into me harder than anger ever could. Inside, a draft article lay on the table, complete with my photo and a headline accusing NORAD of housing an internal threat. He had handed over everything he didn't understand. Before I could speak, his phone rang. Ryland wanted to meet him in 2 hours. My father straightened as though answering a call back to service, completely unaware that Ryland neither understood his insignificance nor his lack of clearance. Two men, each trapped in their own illusion, one chasing purpose, one chasing promotion, and I was in the middle. Then the final alert came. Peterson had filed for emergency detainment. If I resisted, they would twist it into proof. There was only one move left: let them touch me first. Long enough for Helios to intervene cleanly. I looked at both of my parents and felt the line shift beneath my feet. This wasn't a family dispute anymore. This was my father's ego colliding with national security. And I knew exactly who would be crushed if I miscalculated. My mother asked me to join her at the Veterans fundraiser, hoping for a calm night neither of us expected. I went anyway, partly for her, partly because running from the chaos my father created wouldn't stop it. The air outside smelled of burning pine and grilled meat, the familiar scent of small-town gatherings in the West. Inside, guitar music and warm conversation wrapped around the room, but none of it settled my nerves. Then I saw him near the stage, hand tucked inside his jacket. One glance was enough. The photocopied satellite document he had stolen. A cold thread slid down my spine. He wasn't hiding it. He intended to use it. I watched him lean toward a circle of old service buddies, whispering with a feverish pride that made my stomach twist. He believed tonight was his moment, that exposing me would somehow redeem the life he thought I'd wasted. I stepped toward him, hoping to stop him, but he clutched the paper like scripture and told me I should be grateful. He would put me back on the right path. The words hit harder than a slap. Then my phone buzzed. Peterson deployed. Confirm. 4 words that made the room tilt. Ryland had mobilized a unit without federal authorization. My father climbed nearer to the stage, ready to unfold the page in front of the whole room. Before I could act, another alert appeared. 1 green dot. Helios was on the way. The collision course was set. My father, Peterson, and my hidden identity, barreling toward each other with no stopping point. I stood frozen, a cold glass in my hand, feeling like I was watching a ship speed toward the rocks with me locked on deck. The moment the Peterson officers entered, the room fell silent. Their steps were fast, uneven, the walk of men out of their depth. Guests moved aside as they closed in on me. My father watched with a pride so blinding it bordered on delusion. Cold cuffs locked around my wrists. He raised his hand like someone claiming a victory. The absurdity nearly made me laugh. As they pulled me toward the exit, the overhead lights flickered once. A precise signal. Helios had infiltrated the system. One officer shoved me hard, metal scraping my already bruised wrist. My mother screamed, but I forced myself to stay passive, let them keep making mistakes. Just before they dragged me out, the doors swung open. Helios slipped in quiet, controlled, unmistakably beyond any public military branch. The officers froze. Chief Ryland Hayes stepped forward, eyes fixed on me, and saluted. "Commander Cole, your clearance is verified." Mission continuity protocol is active. Orders received. The words detonated through the room. My father's pride shattered, the photocopied page slipping from his fingers like ash. In that instant, the world I had hidden stepped fully into the light. Chief Hayes's voice sliced through the room with a clarity that stopped everything cold. For a moment, the entire hall seemed to forget how to breathe. Glasses hovered halfway to lips. Conversations froze mid-sentence, and every eye locked onto me standing there in handcuffs, still shaken from the Peterson officer's grip. In that suspended second, the life I lived in shadows collided violently with the one everyone thought they understood. One of the officers tried to protest, but a Helios operative flashed a badge marked with the unmistakable red seal of Protected Ops. Whatever argument the officer had dissolved instantly. Hayes tilted his head slightly, and two Helios members stepped forward, forming a silent, immovable barrier between me and the men who had dragged me across the room minutes earlier. Across the hall, my father's expression crumbled. The photocopied document he'd clung to so tightly slipped from his fingers and hit the floor, folding in on itself like something suddenly worthless. Watching him shrink back, silent and stunned, felt stranger than the cuffs around my wrists. Hayes unlocked them with a quick, careful motion. The sting along my skin was sharp, but it was nothing compared to the years of dismissal behind my father's eyes. The Peterson officers mumbled about acting under authorization, but I cut through their excuses, laying out every line of authority they had overstepped until they backed away and hurried out, barely able to look at me. When I finally faced my father, he looked emptied out, as if the structure holding him upright had buckled. I spoke quietly, letting him feel each word. He had crossed a boundary he never should have touched. Helios closed around me as we left, and behind us, the hall stayed frozen like the echo of a silent explosion. One that shattered 40 years of illusion in a single night. Helios drove me through the night toward Colorado Springs in a black SUV, the silence inside heavier than the darkness outside. No one spoke. I watched the streetlights smear across the window, each flash echoing the pulse still hammering in my chest from everything that had unfolded in Flagstaff. The vehicle slipped through the base gate without resistance, but the ease of entry only sharpened the dread of what was waiting. I was taken straight to a secured conference room where representatives from NORAD, Defense Space, Intelligence, and the Unified Command were already seated. They hadn't gathered to debate protocol. They were here to manage the fallout my father had ignited. He was escorted in through another door, his posture bent, the confidence he'd paraded hours earlier stripped away. The photocopied satellite document lay under the harsh white light, exposing every reckless choice he had made. When asked how he obtained it, he said he only wanted to protect the country. The investigators didn't soften their tone. One asked if he truly believed I was aiding foreign forces simply because he saw unfamiliar notations on a classified diagram. My father had no answer. The council laid out the reality he had violated national security, exposed strategic material, and jeopardized a program he was never cleared to know existed, not out of malice, but out of refusal to accept the limits of his own knowledge. 3 hours later, the judgment fell. Loss of veteran privileges, loss of pension, loss of access, referral for federal investigation. When he rose, his shoulders sagged under the truth he couldn't outrun. I left the room before he could look at me, closing the door on 40 years of living beneath his shadow. The next morning, I walked back into NORAD's command center, the familiar wash of blue light sliding across metal walls as the low hum of the servers pulsed like a heartbeat through the floor. Nothing in the room had changed. The satellite map still traced its thin glowing arcs across the globe, indifferent to the night that had torn my world in two, but every step I took reminded me that nothing would ever be the same again. Helios rose to their feet as I entered. No ceremony, no whispers, no pity. Only the quiet respect of people who had seen exactly what I'd endured and believed I had earned my place among them. For the first time, I felt the weight of their trust settle around me like armor instead of expectation. General Carter approached without fanfare, opened a small box, and fastened a medal to my chest with a steady hand. No applause followed, only his firm nod and a simple statement that struck deeper than any commendation. Well done. Coal. It was the closest thing to freedom I had ever felt. I paused before the satellite display, the blue light catching the faint red mark still circling my wrist. A reminder of the line I'd crossed and the one I'd never returned to. My phone buzzed with a message from my mother asking if I could speak to my father. I let the screen dim. Not out of anger, but because I no longer needed to shrink myself to fit anyone's vision. I turned to my team and let out a quiet breath. All right, let's get back to work.